Okay, so continuing on from our last video, we have this basic Energy Plus model with everything defaulted except for the required variables that we specified here. In this video, we're going to discuss how to specify parameters and how to feed those parameters into the templates, and a few different ways to vary those parameters. So the first thing we're going to have to do here is add an interface to the top of our root file. So we do that by less than %pound or hashtag interface in all caps, and then we end that with a %greater than. And now in this interface, this is where we specify any parameters that we want, and these are, you can think of these as like local variables. We can name them whatever we want to name them. So we'll call a parameter name, and that's just going to be the name of our building. And we'll set the default equal to this building name. And now we're going to feed that building name into our general template. So if we just look at that general template again, we have these parameters that we can feed into it. Here we're going to feed in our variable name for this building name. So the way that we do that is we put a comma after the quotes and then colon, then the name of the parameter in the template, and we're feeding in our parameter name, which is just name. And if we had other parameters we wanted to specify, like, well, let's just do another one, orientation, we can feed in an orientation of something other than our default orientation, which is 0. So that's the north axis. So we can call this our, we'll just call it north axis variable, and we'll set that default to 30. And now we're feeding this parameter name, north axis, in for our orientation. We could also just, if we didn't want to define a parameter, we could also just feed in a variable like that. Just if it's a number, 30. If it's a name, we could just specify like this. But in this case, since we created those parameters, we'll just feed in our parameter names and save that. And just to make sure everything worked, go back into our bin folder, compose all, one file copied. That's in our runs folder. And it's running smoothly. And just to double check that those parameters were fed in correctly, we have a building name with the star next to it, meaning that the default value was overwritten. This building name and an orientation that was overwritten of 30 degrees. So if we look at our building object, the name is this building name and the north axis is 30 degrees. So now let's add a parameter that, not necessarily to the interface, but pass a parameter in one of these templates that's a little bit more complicated. And so some of the parameters that you change within the templates actually require you to insert other templates. Like right now, we don't have any hot water system, we don't have any chilled water system, we don't have any domestic hot water system in this model at all. And that's because the default heating coils and cooling coils for the zone HVAC VAV system, and then the air handler itself in the system VAV is a, well, let's take a look at those templates. So at the system level, at the air handler, if we open up the vav.imf, we have all our parameter names at the top here, and the heating coil type by default is gas. So that's a gas furnace. we could change that to electric if we wanted electric heating coil or hot water coil, or we could even change that to none, and then we wouldn't have a heating coil at the air handler. But let's just take a look at what does that mean, gas. So if heating coil type equals gas, then it's going to insert a coil heating fuel, and then it will call it whatever the system's name is and heating coil. And then if we look a little bit deeper in this template, it adds all the necessary objects for that heating coil fuel, which is basically a gas furnace heating coil. So if we want to change that to a hot water coil, and actually first let's just look real quick at the zone HVAC template for the VAV system. So this is the terminal units, the zone terminal units that connect to the VAV air handler. And if we look at the heating coil type, that default is also gas. So that's saying that there's a gas furnace in the actual terminal unit. So now if we want to change those coils from gas furnace coils to hot water coils, we would have to specify that parameter. So let's just first do it at the system level, the air handler. We have our heating coil type parameter. So we're going to, when we insert the system VAV.imf, we specify these parameters, which are required, the system name and the zone names. Now we're going to also pass it a heating coil type, and we won't make a local variable for this. We'll just say heating coil type hot water. And you can imagine as you add more and more parameters here, this line is just going to keep getting longer and longer. So we can actually put the parameters underneath the insert template statement, and it's a little more compact that way. So heating coil type, setting that to hot water. So if we just try to save this and run it as is, we have to compose it, and it composed just fine. It created instance.idf in our baseline folder. Now if we try to run it, it'll give us this error that we don't have a hot water loop. Just to show you that error message, say severe plant component heating, hot water coil VAV1 heating coil was not found on any plant loops. So that's because we didn't insert a hot water template. We have no boiler or a hot water loop in this model. So we have to add that. So we can do that by typing insert in the system folder. There's a template called hotwater.imf. And let's take a look at that. In the system folder, hotwater.imf. So this is our hot water template with the boiler, and it has a sizing plant object. And you can look at this in more detail, but I'm just going to look at the parameters right now. So we have required parameter system name because it has no default value, and zone names. And everything else can just be left defaulted to make it easier for now. So we'll pass it a system name, and we'll just call it HW for hot water. And then zone names, and we have to pass it a list here of zone names. And zone names actually isn't a great parameter name, and you can change that if you want. We even, we have a comment here, should be a different identifier because it's not necessarily zones. In this case, we want to pass it VAV1 because that's the component that we need to add to this hot water loop. So we'll type in our list VAV-1, and then we'll save that. We will go back in our bin folder and compose that model again. One file copied, and now we'll run that again. And this time it runs just fine. So again, that was just adding a heating coil type of hot water to the VAV air handler. If we want to do the same thing to our terminal units, the zone HVAC VAV objects, we can pass it in our VAV zone HVAC template. We can pass it a heating coil type, hot water. And again, these can be single quotes or double quotes, it doesn't really matter. And we'll do that for each of the 3 zones. So now we'll have hot water coils on our terminal units and a hot water coil on our VAV system. But now, since we added the hot water coils to our zone terminal units, we also have to add those zones now to our zone names list on the hot water loop. So we'll pass it zone A, zone B, and zone C. Now we'll save that, and our previous run ran successfully, but now we're going to compose it again, compose all, and now we'll run it again, and this time it's running with hot water coils on the terminal units. And we can check that. Probably the easiest way to check that is using the IDF editor. Go to our Modelkit catalyst folder, examples, simple project Modelkit, in the runs directory, baseline instance.idf. Look at that in the IDF editor. And if you don't know this already, you can press Ctrl-L and that will limit the objects to just the ones that appear in our IDF file. And now if we look at coil heating, we have coil heating water coils. And our run ran successfully. We could also change, right now our air handler has a DX cooling coil because that's the default cooling coil type is DX. We could change that to chilled water. And if you haven't guessed already, now we'll have to add a chilled water loop. So just like we added the system hot water, we'll do an insert system chilled water.imf. And that also has a required parameter called system name. And we'll just call that CHW. And we also have to pass it the zone names, or in this case, it's just the system name, and that's a list. So we'll pass that VAV1. We'll save that. Compose our model again and run it. And it looks like that's running just fine. So that was just to demonstrate that, you know, some of these parameters, if we change them, it requires us to insert other templates or change something else in our root file in order for that parameter to be passed and for our model to run correctly with that parameter. So hopefully this video has provided a better explanation of how to pass these parameters and vary these parameters within the root file. In the next video, I'll show you how to vary these parameters external to the root file in what we call case files. And these are just text files that you can pass with the Modelkit command that will vary the parameters that are listed in this interface with whatever the parameter values are in the text file. So I'll talk about all that in more detail in the next video.